This meeting is being recorded, so welcome to our Legacy of the Mercury 13 ahead of the Blue Origin launch in about an hour. So I'm going to turn everything over to Marcy, who is our space advisor. She's in another part of the office here. Marcy, I'll mute you. Since you're getting the feedback. So Marcy is going to give us a rundown on the legacy of the Mercury 13, the group of 13 pioneering women that Wally Funk was a part of. This is one of the programs we did earlier this year at the International Women's Air and Space Museum, whose mission is to preserve, educate, and inspire folks of all ages about the contributions of women in all areas of aviation and aerospace. So in a few moments, I'm going to try to get this onto Facebook. I'm having some technical difficulties, but Marcy is going to take it from here. So Marcy.
Got it. Thank you, Sarah. And good morning, everybody. Welcome to launch day for Blue Origin and Wally Funk, member of the Mercury 13. We're very excited about her launch today, as you can only imagine. As far as background for that, before we get to the launch coverage with Blue Origin, I'm going to give you a little background on the Mercury 13 and give you sort of the context of what happened with them over the years. Okay. All right. So let me just give you a little background on the museum. Our mission is to preserve, educate, and inspire in all areas of women in aerospace. And this first slide here talks about Mercury Women, Forgotten Link to the Future, which is the title of our exhibit about the Mercury Women. And the reason why we titled that, and actually I came up with the title, but the reason why we titled it that is because we wanted to give the emphasis on not just looking back at the Mercury Women in terms of what they did, but also looking forward and how they inspired other women who got into the aerospace business, became astronauts, engineers, etc. And this year it's 60 years since the initial testing. And I'm also going to talk about how the Mercury women's efforts to become astronauts, and previous versions of this talk, it was none of them did, but now we've got one who's going to become an astronaut today. So that's really exciting. So anyhow, just looking at the slides here, this is Jerry Cobb, and she was the record-breaking pilot who was the first woman to pass the Mercury Woman tests. And our museum recently received some new Cobb artifacts that we're busy cataloging. Also in the upper right, we've got Sally Ride. As you probably know, she's the first American woman in space back in 1983. And then on the bottom left is Pam Melroy. She's one of the first US women pilot astronauts at NASA, and she's now the deputy administrator at NASA. So that means she's number 2 in command there. And then on the bottom right is a newer astronaut, that's Nicole Mann. She's in NASA's Commercial Crew Astronaut Program to be the first US woman flying a test flight of a new vehicle, and that's going to be the Boeing Starliner. And finally, second and hopefully final uncrewed test flight is going to be launching not too long from now on July 30th up to the International Space Station. These are the original Mercury 7 astronauts. You probably are familiar with some of these folks. Alan Shepard, John Glenn. They were selected back in April 1959. And they were all military test pilots. And that's important because at the time, no women were allowed to be military test pilots. So that pretty much excluded women from joining their ranks. Also, as context for that era, in 1960, only 25% of women had jobs, and women were not allowed to serve in the military. A woman needed her husband's permission in order to take out a loan or buy property back in that day. Here's the Mercury 7 astronauts and the next group called the New Nine or Next Nine. And they were selected in 1962. And once again, you notice they're all white males, although at this time they didn't need to be military test pilots. So 2 in this class were civilian test pilots. One is Neil Armstrong, who ended up being the first man on the moon. And then the other was Elliot C., who unfortunately died in an accident early in the program and did not to space. So the Mercury women, who are the main characters in this tale? We've got General Donald Flickinger on the left, Jerry Cobb in the center, and Dr. Randy Lovelace on the right. Back in 1959, General Flickinger and Dr. Lovelace suggested it would be more practical from an engineering standpoint to send women rather than men into space, basically because of lower body weights and less oxygen requirements. General Flickinger and Dr. Lovelace were friends. So in mid-1959, Flickinger started a program called the Women in Space Soonest, or WISE, with the U.S. Air Force Research Command. And Dr. Lovelace already had established a series of rigorous medical, physical, and physiological tests for the male astronaut candidates. Flickinger and Lovelace happened to meet Jerry Cobb, who's in the center, in Miami Beach, Florida. The 2 men had returned from a meeting that was in the Soviet Union in Moscow, and they learned at that time that the Russians were planning to send women into space. So they asked Cobb to become their first test subject for Project WISE, and she said yes. But before her testing even began, the US Air Force withdrew its support for Project WISE, and it was canceled. Then Flickinger asked Dr. Lovelace, could you take over the program? And he said yes, with his private foundation. This time it was called the Women in Space Program. And doing the financing for the program was famous aviator Jackie Cochran and her husband. So Jackie is shown here on this slide with James Webb, who was the NASA administrator, the top person at NASA back in 1961. And in the 1930s, Cochran set numerous speed and distance and altitude records. During World War II, she founded and led the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP. And she aggressively lobbied for Dr. Lovelace to get the 1939 prestigious Collier Award, and he was very grateful for that effort. He also served as her personal physician, and her husband, Floyd Odlum, was chairman of Dr. Lovelace's board of directors. So when Cochran learned about the plan to test a series of women, she and her husband, like I said, agreed to fund the program. Cochran wanted to be the leader of the program, and she wanted to be a candidate for testing. She was considerably over the age limits, and she had health issues, and so she was not a candidate. So the Mercury 13 women, here they are. Initially, there were about 25 women who underwent the tests at Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and 13 did exceptionally well, and they became known as the First Lady Astronaut Trainees, or FLATs. Jerry Cobb, who was the first one of them, gave them that name. But later, after a 1995 TV documentary, the producer nicknamed them the Mercury 13. So this slide shows all the 13 women who passed the test. And we've got Jerry Cobb on the top left. And she later, after doing her test flying and speed records, she flew humanitarian missions into the Amazon jungle for many years. Next to her, we've got Wally Funk, geez. And we've also got a trophy that she donated to the museum. And Wally, besides going into space today, before that, she has about 19,000 flight hours as a pilot. She's a flight instructor. She was an FAA inspector. She was a National Transportation Safety Board investigator. And she was the youngest of the women at age 21. To her right is Bee Stedman. She started her own flight school and was once president of our museum. And to her right is Irene Leverton. She flew after the Mercury 13 tests for a manufacturing company and owned an aviation consulting company. And down in the middle, we've got Sarah Gorlick-Ratley on the left. She flew in the powder derbies and other air races, and she also was an electrical engineer. To her right is Jane Hart, who earned her pilot license during World War II and later became the first licensed female helicopter pilot in Michigan. Her husband, Philip Hart, was a US Senator for Michigan, and she also was one of the founders of NOW, or the National Organization for Women. To her right is Jean Hickson, who was a WASP, a flight instructor, and also a teacher in nearby to us, Akron, Ohio. And then next we've got Janora Stumbaugh-Jessen, who was also a flight instructor, an advisor to the FAA, and an aviation writer. And to her right is Jerry Sloan Truhill, who flew B-52s for Texas Instruments and helped develop following radar. And this was kind of a precursor to the landing radar that the NASA Mars Perseverance rover used during its entry, descent, and landing back in February. Then we've got Rhea Hurl Allison Woltman, and she was an executive pilot for an aircraft sales firm and flew in the Powder Puff races. And next on the bottom, on the left there's the twins, Marion and Jan Dietrich. Marion was an aviation rider, flew charters and ferried aircraft, and Jan was a flight instructor, chief pilot for a flight school, and also corporate pilot. And next is Myrtle Thompson Cagle, who worked as a flight instructor and aviation writer. And next to her is a wedding dress, which she donated to the museum. And what makes it kind of different and unusual is it's made out of a parachute. And unfortunately, she never wore this wedding dress since her fiance at the time died in the war. And all of the women needed to be qualified pilots with a substantial number of hours flown. They all needed to be under 5 feet 11 inches in height. They needed to have good health, needed to be under 35 years, except there were a few on that. They needed to hold an FAA instrument rating and medical certificates. And here's some photos from Jerry Cobb's testing. And the top slide on the left shows Jerry testing in the gimbal rig in the altitude wind tunnel in April 1960 at Lewis Research Center, which is now the Glenn Research Center. And this interesting looking device is called MASTIF, M-A-S-T-I-F, or Multiple Axis Space Test Inertia Facility. And you know, NASA likes acronyms. This was used to train the Mercury 7 astronauts to control the spin of a tumbling spacecraft. And it was also for them to learn how to control pitch, roll, and yaw all at the same time. And those are the three dimensions you need to use when you're flying a spacecraft. Also, there's an image of Cobb on a tilt table in the bottom left. And interestingly, the Russians still use tilt tables to this day before their Soyuz flights up to the International Space Station for both cosmonauts and astronauts. And it's used to get more blood flow into their heads before launching into space. Here's this is from a Parade magazine issue back in April 1961 of Marion and Jan. And this article was written by Jackie Cochran, again, who was funding the testing. And some of Cochran's words in the article are really kind of haunting as you look back at it. Cochran wrote, "Women will fly into space just as certainly as men will." And then again, this is before men had launched, only not so soon. I myself, this is Jackie talking, while not a participant in the Mercury Women program, expect to fly in space before I hang up my flying gear. I think the day of women in space will come sooner than most people will believe. And this image shows Cochran looking on in the background in the middle as one of the Dietrich twins is doing some of the testing. And here's Look magazine. This is from the February 2nd, 1960 cover. And in 1959, NASA administered these tests at the request of Look magazine for an article on aerobatic pilot Betty Skelton. The Mercury 7 astronauts nicknamed her Mercury 7.5, which some felt was condescending. So this was not real testing for a woman, but rather just a publicity stunt for Look magazine. And interestingly, the article lists what the first space girl will be. What it says. It says, She may be the scientist wife of a pilot engineer. Her specialties will range from astronomy to zoology. She will adjust well to isolation and be able to hibernate. Her personality will both soothe and stimulate others on her space team. Yes, that's what it said. So, even though Dr. Lovelace had designed the tests for men for NASA, all the Lovelace women's tests were done without NASA's involvement. Some of the women thought the tests would be the first step to becoming astronauts, including Wally Funk, who's actually going to become an astronaut today. But when NASA officials learned about additional testing at the Navy base in Pensacola, Florida, NASA informed the Navy that they were not NASA-sanctioned tests and were canceled. Later in 1962, congressional hearings were held, and that's what this slide is about. And it helped that the Mercury 13's Jane Hart was the wife of a US Senator, Philip Hart, in getting the hearings actually going. And although US Representative Ken Heckler said at the time women can be astronauts, by the end of 1962, Congress issued a report that the role of women in space program needed further study. Jerry Cobb and Jane Hart testified, shown on the bottom slides here, along with recently flown astronauts John Glenn and Scott Carpenter. Jackie Cochran also testified against the women, and she sided with NASA. And Glenn had his well-known quote, "The men go off and fight the wars and design the airplanes, come back and help design and build and test them. The fact that women are not in this field is a matter of our social order." That was 1962. But a few things changed after that to change the course of women astronauts. And a little context about what was going on at the time before that. First, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which was a book that questioned the cultural gender roles back in 1963. Congress passed the Equal Payment and 1964 Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination based on race and gender. And in 1966, the National Organization for Women, or NOW, as I mentioned before, was founded to promote full equality of the sexes. And again, Jane Hart of the Mercury 13 was one of NOW's founders. NASA then finally accepted women in its 1978 class. That's who these ladies are. And they were brought in to fly the new space shuttle. And the 6 women were Sally Ride, who was, of course, the first American woman in space. And Jane Hart actually witnessed her first launch back in 1983. Sally flew on 2 flights. Next was Judy Resnick, who's an Akron, Ohio native. She had 1 flight, and then unfortunately she died on the Challenger accident back in 1986. Next was Kathy Sullivan, who had 3 flights and actually became the first US woman to walk in space. Then was Anna Fisher, who had 1 flight. Ray Seddon, who had 3 flights. And then last but not least was Shannon Lucid. And she actually spent the most time in space, a total of 223 days. She's the only US woman to do a long duration mission on the Russian space station Mir, which was the predecessor to the International Space Station. All 6 were either scientists, medical doctors, or engineers. And by the way, in researching this, I found out that Deke Slayton, who was of the Mercury 7 astronauts, originally only one of these women made the cut of the 6. And he wrote that there was some last minute politics and 5 pilots were dropped and replaced with 5 female mission specialists. And those pilots were picked in a couple of years later. Ray Seddon said, "This group of women proved that they could do the job of mission specialists. But the question remained, could a woman be a shuttle pilot and a shuttle commander?" The answer to that is, of course, yes. So here are the female space shuttle pilot astronauts. Eileen Collins, who's in the center. She was only the second woman to be a US Air Force test pilot school at Edwards Air Force Base in California. And in 1990, she was selected as the first woman pilot astronaut in the space shuttle program. And here's what Eileen said in the foreword to the latest book by Wally Funk that she wrote called Higher, Faster, Longer. She said, "It took many years for NASA to get to that point, but I believe the Mercury 13 women helped make it happen. They had demonstrated years earlier that women had the physical and aptitude to perform as astronauts. They set the stage for NASA women of the future, and my generation benefited from them." And also shown Susan Kilrin, she picked as a pilot astronaut in 94. She flew on 2 missions, but was never a commander. And Pamela Melroy on the left, and she was picked as a pilot astronaut in 94 and served in the US Air Force, and again, was a test pilot. She flew on 2 shuttle missions as a pilot and then was commander on STS-120. And that made her the second female to command a shuttle flight. And she also took one of our patches from the museum up on that flight, and we got it back later, so you can see it at our museum. She also donated her US Air Force flight jacket to our museum, and now she's second in command at NASA as the deputy administrator. This image shows several members of the Mercury 13 who were all invited by astronaut Eileen Collins when she launched as the first female pilot of the space shuttle in 1995 for STS-63. And on the left is Janora Jessen, Wally Funk, who's going to space today, Jerry Cobb, Jerry Sloan, Sarah Ratley, Myrtle Cagle, and B. Stedman. Collins was also the first female commander of a space shuttle in 99 on STS-93, which deployed the Chandra X-ray Observatory, and later on the return to flight mission after the Columbia accident. So John Glenn, he got to go to space again back in 1998, and this was on STS-95. He volunteered for a study in terms of an older person going on a space shuttle. At this time, he was 77 years old. He then became the oldest person to fly in space and the only one to fly in both Mercury and shuttle. Today, Wally Funk is going to break that record because she's 82, so she will now be the oldest person to fly in space. Although there may be a caveat since she's only doing a suborbital flight. Glenn still will have the record for actually orbiting at that age. At the time, there was a grassroots effort to see about getting Jerry Cobb to fly on a similar research mission, but for a woman. And Cobb was 67 then. The 99th group of women pilots, many US senators and representatives gave their support. And Cobb even met with First Lady Hillary Clinton and had a brief meeting with John Glenn, who she hadn't seen since the 62 hearings. But the grassroots campaign was not successful, and Cobb never flew to space. Here are just a few of NASA's most recent female astronauts, along with the first one, Sally Ride, who's in the center on the top. And Ride wrote a letter when our museum opened an exhibit back in October 1987, when we were at that time in Centerville, Ohio, near Dayton, Ohio. And here's what Sally Ride said. She said, "Although you were not able to realize your collective goal, your accomplishments demonstrated that women could perform and achieve in space and helped open the door for those of us who followed." And also on the top, on the left, is former NASA astronaut Peggy Whitson, who became the first female space station commander back in 2007 on Expedition 16. And she also became the commander again on Expedition 51 in 2017. And she has the most cumulative time in space, 665 days total on 3 long duration missions. And that's for any American man or woman. And Whitson also has the most EVA or spacewalking time for a female, 10 EVAs, 60 hours. And her heroes were the first female astronauts picked in 1978 when she graduated from high school. She said, "It took my idea, my dream of wanting to be an astronaut and realistic." And on the upper right is Karen Nyberg, who retired in 2020, and she flew on STS-124 in 2008, and also was a flight engineer on Expedition 36-37 on the space station in 2013. Her inspiration to become an astronaut also harkens back to the selection of the first 6 NASA women. From her Instagram account, she said, "When NASA selected the first 6 women astronauts in 1978, it had a huge impact on me as a little girl. It allowed me to never doubt that being an astronaut is something that I, too, could dream of doing. And on the bottom left is Sandy Magnus. This former astronaut flew on STS-112 in 2002, and she was a flight engineer on Expedition 18 to the International Space Station in 2008. And then she was mission specialist on the very last shuttle flight, STS-135 in 2011. And when I spoke to her at NASA Glenn in Cleveland in 2011, post-flight from STS-135, I asked her what it was like to be the other bookend to Sally Ride, who was the first woman to fly in the space shuttle. She said the idea that someone could put her in the same sentence as Ride was just amazing, because she remembered when Ride was picked in 1988, when Sandy was then a high school freshman, and thinking then that she could see a path to becoming an astronaut. To be part of a bookend with her, she said, was surreal. The center on the bottom is Mae Jemison, who was the first African-American woman in space on STS-47 in 1992. She grew up watching Apollo missions, like I did, on TV, but was upset when there were no female astronauts. But Jemison said she was inspired by actress Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek's TV show at the time. Yay, Star Trek. Jemison now works to inspire a new generation. And finally, on the bottom right is astronaut Megan McArthur. She flew on the last shuttle mission to repair the Hubble Space Telescope in 2009. And she's up in space right now. She took a SpaceX Dragon as part of Crew 2, and she was the pilot on this crew, even though she was a mission specialist on her shuttle flight. And I kind of think she represents a new breed of astronauts who can be a pilot, even though you weren't a pilot previously. This is NASA's Mission Control, and that's in Houston, Texas. And this is during Peggy Whitson's last space station. You can see her floating on the back. And a few of the former women astronauts and some of the current ones are shown in the front of the screen there. Currently, there are 45 active NASA astronauts and 15 are female. And here's two of them. We've got Christina Cook on the right and Jessica Meir on the left. And they were doing a spacewalk. Again, this is the first all-female spacewalk up on the International Space Station. This was back in October 2019, and they did two more back in January of 2020. And they were doing battery replacements on the ISS. This was during Expedition 62. And we've got the Artemis program that's going to be getting going hopefully at the end of this year with an uncrewed flight to the moon. And that's the Orion capsule in the center that's going to be going to the moon. And I actually got to see that here in Sandusky at NASA's Plumbrook Station, now Armstrong Center. And these are some of the women who've been picked to be in the Artemis program. Stephanie Wilson on the top left, who's flown 3 shuttle flights. Kayla Barron next to her, who was picked in 2017 and has now actually been named to be part of Crew 3 to go on a space Dragon up to the International Space Station this fall. And then Jessica Watkins to the right of the Orion capsule. She was picked in 2017. And next to her is Jessica Meir, who has that one long duration mission on the space station. And on the bottom row, we've got Anne McLean, who has one long duration space station mission. Jasmine Mobelli, who was picked in 2017. And to her right is Kate Rubins, who just came back from the International Space Station on her second long duration mission back in April of this year. And then Nicole Mann in the blue flight suit. And she's set to fly as the first Boeing Starliner female test pilot. And they've got the uncrewed flight coming up July 30th. And then last but not least is Christina Cook, who set a record of 328 consecutive days on the space station on her very first flight. And that's the longest continuous time in space right now for a female. Here's a postal cover signed by 4 of the Mercury women when they were here at the museum. And it shows Myrtle Cagle's signature on the top, and then Irene Leverton, and then Wally Funk, who's going in space today, yay. And Janora Jessen on the bottom. And sadly, only 2 of the Mercury 13 women are still with us, Wally and Janora Jessen. So even before Wally's launch coming up to space, the Mercury women were definitely relevant in the news, in TV, etc. In the center is a poster from a Netflix documentary from 2018. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. They sought help from our museum in making their film. And also there's 2 recent TV shows that include some Mercury women, but in a different kind of an alternate reality. Disney Plus has The Right Stuff with Mercury 7 Gordon Cooper's wife, Trudy, who was a pilot in real life, meeting aviator Jerry Cobb to help form a women's astronaut corps, which didn't go anywhere, even in the fictional series. And then over on the right, we have Apple TV Pluses for All Mankind. And again, alternate reality. And the main character in this, Molly Cobb, is loosely based on Jerry Cobb, same last name there. And I recently had a conversation with the actress who plays her, Sonia Walger, on Instagram to see if she had read about Jerry preparing the role. She said she did, and also that Jerry was an inspiration to many. And she also has some more thoughts about Wally Funk going to space today. She said on Instagram, "Thank you, Wally Funk, for blazing this trail, for inspiring so many female aviators, for never giving up hope, and also the For All Mankind executive producer chimed in, and she said, we talked about Wally so much in the writer's room in season 1 and the heartbreak of her story. And they're so happy to see her dreams finally become realized today." Here's a couple patches that were done in honor of the Mercury women. First one on the left is an older one, and then a new one on the right designed by patch artist Tim Gagnon. And also here's some images from a proposed Mercury women Lego set featuring Dr. Lovelace on the left and Jerry Cobb in the center and Wally Funk on the right. And you can still vote for the Lego set. There's only a few days left. So go vote. See if you can get this one made, because it would be really cool. And yes, today, after a 60-year wait, Wally Funk is going to be flying up to space on Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket. And that's kind of what we're celebrating, eh? Here's an image from her on the right from when she was at our museum in March 2019 doing a presentation. And while she was denied a chance to fly in space in the 60s, she's finally getting her flight 60 years later on the Blue Origin crew, which is pictured on the left. And there's a little bit of irony in this as well, since she's going to be flying on a rocket called New Shepard, named after Mercury 7's Alan Shepard. And she'll also be breaking the record for the oldest person in space, John Glenn. And he was the one who testified before Congress about women in social order, as you may recall me saying. And this space flight has been a lifelong dream for Wally, and she's really been trying to do this for such a long time, and we're really excited that it's finally coming to fruition today. Next is a cartoon from Florida Today newspaper. This was from the time of Sally Ride's death in 2012. And so this young girl reading on her computer about Sally Ride's death is saying, wait, you mean there wasn't a time that there weren't women astronauts? And it's pretty cool that the young girl doesn't realize that there was a time without women astronauts. And that's what I was discussing. Here's some other books you can read about the Mercury women if you want to read some more. We have a couple of them for sale in our bookstore or online. In fact, we have Wally Funk's newest book, Higher, Faster, Longer, which she wrote. And also Wally Funk's, the other book about Wally Funk on the right there, Race to Space. And Fighting for Space, that's the one that talks about Jackie Cochran and Jerry Cobb, and it's kind of intertwined between the two of them. And we also have some women in aerospace cards, and Wally Funk is in the set along with Jerry Cobb. And there's a group Mercury 13 card and many female astronauts. We've got a bunch of the hidden figures like Katherine Johnson, if you saw that movie, excellent movie. And again, you can find them in our gift shop or online store. And last image shows Wally with our Mercury Women Forgotten Link to the Future exhibit. And again, this is from when she spoke here in 2019. And besides this Blue Origin flight today, Wally paid $200,000 a few years back to fly in space on Virgin Galactic's rocket-powered vehicle, just a couple weeks ago. So today is flight number 1. Maybe she'll get flight number 2, which would be cool. And here's some general information about our museum. If you want to email us with any questions you have, our hours, website, and if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. You could put them in the chat.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you, Marcy. If you have any questions, please, yes, do put them in the chat for those who are joining us by Zoom. But you can also comment on the Facebook Live that we have streaming right now as well. This disembodied voice is Sarah. I'm the executive director here at the museum. And as we've been going and while we wait for some questions to pop up, I have been looking on my other computer over here, and it looks like the crew of the New Shepard with Blue Origin is in the staging area right now. So they are right on target. In the next 31 minutes, they will be launching. So if you have any questions, Marcy is happy to answer them about the Mercury 13, about the women in space, anything about our exhibits on women in space here at the museum. Oh, excellent. Brenda said, great job, and she hopes to use some of this information in her classroom. So wonderful, excellent. We want to share these stories in the classrooms. We know that, especially for teachers, you are strapped for time in the content that you can hit, and we are excited to provide that additional information for you to supplement your lesson plans. Wonderful. Emily asks, are any of your exhibits resources available remotely / online? Thank you so much for the presentation. And the answer to that, Emily, is yes. We do have some of the resources available online. We recently launched our first virtual exhibit looking at the first half of the 20th century for women in aviation. So we are looking to get some of the Mercury 13 Women in Space more online as well. But if you go to our website, iwasm.org, and you go to our research and learn page, we have an online catalog that you can take a look at of what we have. So all excellent questions. Not seeing anything on the Facebook Live as of right now, but what are some other questions that we may have? So maybe I have a question for Marcy. She's laughing at me over here. So I know we're going to talk about it later this afternoon, but what are some of your favorite memories of Wally being here in 2019?
Yes, I guess my absolute favorite was when I got to take her over to NASA Glenn for a tour in the morning before she did her presentation in the evening that day. And she was just so excited to go to NASA Glenn and do the tour and speak to the folks working there and learn about everything. She just was just jumping for joy. And then especially another memory that I have is afterwards, before we came back to the museum, I took her to lunch and we're sitting there at lunch and I pull out my phone, and it happened to be the day, it was supposed to be the first all-woman spacewalk, but things didn't work out right with the spacesuit sizing. And the female astronaut doing the spacewalk that day, and I pulled it up on my phone to watch the spacewalk with Wally, and she was just so excited. Because like Wally and I, we both like to watch NASA TV a lot, but she was excited I could pull it up on my phone and we could sit there eating lunch and watch the spacewalk happening, 200 or so miles up above us in space right as it was going on.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Any other questions before we kind of hit the pause button before, the actual launch? Oh, Emily, do you have a favorite out of the books about the Mercury 13? That is an excellent question.
Yeah, I showed on the slide before some different ones. Um, and I think they're all great. They all have different pluses and minuses. Wally's latest book is nice because it talks about a lot of the different training that she did after the Mercury testing program, which, you know, right after it got canceled, she was not going to let that limit what she could do in her life. She, of course, but she also started to take more tests and wanted to see really throughout her life what she could do to increase her chances of trying to get into space. Besides applying to NASA several times to become an astronaut, which didn't happen, she did do a lot of these testing both in the United States, and also she went over to Russia to do some different testing to see if she could become an astronaut. And if you tune in later this afternoon, you can hear Wally talking about these testing programs that she did later on, because I was able to do some series of interviews with her before she did her presentation back in March of 2019 here.
Awesome. Excellent. Excellent. All right. So we are, about 26 minutes according to Blue Origin away from official liftoff. So we are going to go ahead and take a quick break. Everyone go grab another cup of coffee. I know that's where I'm going to head right now, or grab some tea and cozy up to your computer or your TV, however you are joining us today. And we will be back with the official launch of Blue Origin's New Shepard with Wally Funk aboard. So thank you so much, and we will be back soon.
Thank you, Sarah.
Go
Thank you,
Wally.
Marcy. And I'm looking forward to 1 o'clock. I'll see you then.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Mark, and we will see y'all soon. Thank you.